cried out with a mother's grief, "None but Jesus heard me, and aren't I a woman?" And then she points to another speaker. He talks about intellect. What's intellect got to do with women's rights or black folks' rights? And then she finds another man, that little man in black there, pointing to another pastor. He says women can't have as much rights as man because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did he come from? From God and a woman. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down, all alone, we women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now that we are asking to do it, the men better let us. At that point, she stooped down to pick up her sunbonnet that she had dropped at her feet, and then she turned to conclude in sweetness, "Obliged to you for hearing me." Now, by the end of the 19th century, so 50 years later, 40, 50 years later, women's rights had started to become more respectable. By then, it no longer took the courage of a woman like Sojourner Truth to demand women's rights. And one person who was critical to this transformation was a devout Methodist woman by the name of Frances Willard. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of Willard before? Okay, not many, so my pleasure to introduce Frances Willard to you. Willard was from Evanston, Illinois, a town that came to be known as the Methodist Mecca of the Midwest. How many of you have a Methodist background somewhere in your history? Okay, so a few more of you. So this is kind of your story here. She was an enterprising woman, and she found ingenious ways to work within the confines of Victorian Christianity to expand women's influences. Now, as a Methodist, and you can think of Methodism essentially as an evangelical denomination in the 19th century, Willard was a product of two kind of competing religious traditions. And again, we can think of Methodism as essentially an evangelical revivalist tradition in 19th century America. So on the one hand, Methodism had only recently become the dominant religion of the nation by the latter part of the 19th century. Not too much before, it had been a radical faith of circuit riders and revivalists, but it had recently become more respectable as many of these Methodist converts started to move into the middle class. As they did, they began to found schools and colleges like Northwestern and Garrett Biblical Institute, and they began to smooth over the rough edges of their faith and cultural sensibilities, and again, aspire to respectability and influence. Now, for women in the 19th century, respectability was defined by domesticity. This is the era of the cult of true womanhood, if that's familiar to you, when women were kind of placed on pedestals and deemed especially virtuous and delicate, gentle wives and mothers who instilled virtue in the younger generation. And as they were to live their virtuous lives, largely in the private sphere and not tarnish themselves out in the public realm. They were supposed to stay in the confines of the Christian home. My guess is this is a little familiar to you because we're still living with the legacies of this ideology today, some of us more than others. But within Methodism and within evangelical Christianity in the 19th century, there was also a more disruptive force, emphasizing the power of the Holy Spirit and the duty of Christians to respond to the Spirit to reform society. The holiness movement inspired many Methodist women to step out of their domestic sphere. And Frances Willard was the perfect example of this. So I want to tell you a little bit more about Frances Willard because she's a really important figure in the history of American Christianity. So she was a single woman, and she was a leading woman in her community. She had been serving as the president of the Evanston College for Ladies. However, the Great Fire swept through Chicago in 1871, so you're getting a lot of history lessons here. And at that point, a lot of the donors of the Evanston College for Ladies were living in Chicago, or they had properties there. And so it just wiped out the assets. And her College for Ladies fell under the control of Northwestern University. She then became a dean at Northwestern University, which sounds great. And it might have been okay, except that the current president of Northwestern at the time happened to be her former fiance. She broke things off. So he, in her mind, now granted I've read her side of things in her diaries, I haven't read his, but he didn't deem it worthy writing about, but he seemed to be trying to undermine her at every turn. Meanwhile, her male students were not helping matters. Unaccustomed to reciting their lessons to a woman, these roistering youths, her words, devised ingenious ways to try her mettle. They actually conspired to each show up late to her class, but at different intervals. And they knew that there was a very squeaky door to the classroom, and so they would just keep interrupting her lectures. That was one of the things they liked to do. Another time, they actually entrapped a howling cat in her desk drawer. So yes, when you hear that, kids these days, you don't believe it. They've been bad forever. Anyway, ultimately, Frances Willard had enough. She resigned her position, no longer dean of Northwestern College, and instead she went on to lead what would become the most powerful women's organization of the 19th century, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Why temperance? Now, I'm guessing in many circles, probably yours, temperance might seem like a rather prudish cause, right? We're talking don't drink alcohol. Not very much fun. Especially here in Grand Rapids, right? We like to tout our breweries, and we're a cool city and all. But in the 19th century, alcohol and the well-being of women were closely intertwined. With husbands exercising absolute authority over wives and children, women had little recourse. When men spent their time in saloons, see a couple men right there, drinking away their earnings and returning home drunk and often abusive. So temperance was very much a woman's issue. Evangelical women, particularly Methodist women, were at the forefront of the temperance movement. Some actually pursued more militant tactics than Frances Willard. Ever heard of Carrie Nation? Oh man, I should have included a picture of her. She was quite literally an axe-wielding Christian feminist, and she took an axe to saloons and destroyed them. Mm-hmm. Yes, I totally regret not getting a picture of her up there. Anyway, I'm not making this up. But most women, like Willard, pursued more respectable means. See how respectable they look there? They're just praying outside of the saloon and shaming the men inside. Now, Willard understood that temperance had the potential to unite women in a national movement for women's rights. And she was extremely strategic in this purpose. See, women used their supposed moral superiority, their virtue, to make a case for stepping out of the domestic realm and expanding their public role. Because if men could corrupt the home through their drunkenness and abuse, then wasn't it up to women to protect the home? And they needed to do so through temperance reform. And to do so, they needed political power. So when Willard began her work, relatively few respectable, middle-class women supported suffrage or women's rights more broadly, because the ideal of self-sacrifice and domesticity was at the heart of Christian womanhood in most cases. Politics was a man's realm. But Willard made a compelling case that good wives, good Christian wives and mothers, needed the vote to protect their homes, their children from the evils of alcohol. So by framing suffrage as home protection, she helped transform women's suffrage from a disreputable cause to a religious duty, and she brought tens of thousands of Christian women into the suffrage fold. She herself credited the Women's Christian Temperance Union with, as she put it, enlisting in the suffrage movement that important person, the average woman. The woman who believed she had all the rights she needed, who had no desire to vote. She succeeded in making the average woman think it her duty to want to vote. And as she put it, when the average woman wants it, the broad-shouldered, good-natured average man will give it. Now, it wasn't long before Willard expanded the purpose of the WCTU by introducing what she called her Do Everything policy, which was exactly as it sounds. The organization eventually boasted 39 departments and advanced causes ranging from dress reform, wearing bloomers, to world peace, to social purity. Now, this is the Victorian era, So social purity actually meant sexual purity. But once again, despite appearances, don't think that these are a bunch of prudish Victorian women. Social purity activists were fierce critics of the reigning sexual double standard. Again, might sound a little familiar to you, the idea that women were especially pure and virtuous, and then the pressure on women to uphold absolute purity in both action and reputation, otherwise they were relegated, cast off as fallen women. Hardly even women at all, women who didn't deserve any rights and certainly no sympathy. This ideal of female purity and virtue, I want to add, was only ever available to white women of means. And even for white women, it was for many an impossible ideal. Any woman who was promiscuous, women who were raped or abused, women who were driven to prostitution were again deemed beyond redemption and unworthy of legal protection. Meanwhile, promiscuous men went about their respectable lives largely unscathed. In fact, many Victorian Christians actually believed that prostitution was a necessity, because if men were naturally lustful and women naturally virtuous, it doesn't really work out. The equation doesn't work, and that's where prostitutes come in. And so prostitution was deemed necessary. Christian women, these ladies who are temperance advocates, many of them started to call for an end to this sexual double standard. When sexual activity threatened women through unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, the safer path to equality with men seemed to be through male restraint, right? Not saying women can be lustful too, but restraining male sexuality. Now, my favorite social purity activist was a woman by the name of Catherine or Kate Bushnell. In fact, I wrote an entire book on her. Working with Frances Willard, she helped launch the social purity movement in the United States, but she also traveled the world on behalf of the WCTU's Social Purity Department. And as she traveled the world, she was shocked to discover that time and again, she encountered white, Western, Christian men, American and particularly British, who were often very guilty of treating non-Western women with unspeakable cruelty. She did a series of investigations throughout British India and exposed the practice of essentially state-sanctioned, British Empire-sanctioned brothels for British soldiers in which Indian women were entrapped. It was in response to this cruelty that she encountered over and over again that she ultimately concluded that Christianity itself might be to blame. In a remarkable letter that she wrote in 1899, that was long lost to history. This is one of my favorite historical experiences of finding a misfiled letter in an archive in London that had not seen the light of day for at least decades. She outlined her thoughts on this topic. Here's what she said. And she had struggled for years to come to terms with the fact that, again, respectable Christian men were treating women, particularly women of color, with such cruelty. She concluded that women's subordination to men was nothing less than abuse. It facilitated the sexual abuse of wives by husbands and extended this abuse to all women. But Bushnell believed that such teachings went against the heart of the gospel. They were inconsistent with the Christian scriptures when the Christian scriptures were rightly translated and interpreted. Why would Christian husbands, after all, seek to exert power over women? Offered precisely the opposite model of power and sacrifice. Yet men, in their masculine egotism, her words, had produced a whole fossilized system of theology that positioned themselves as glorified and spiritualized, and as the ones who got to teach theology to the other half.